In this video, I'll be building my first small form factor PC to save space in my college dorm. I picked the NR200 from Cooler Master because it's pretty small, but it's still large enough that I'll be able to build somewhat easily. And I think it looks nice, and it also just doesn't look super over the top, so it doesn't look like a great thing to steal out of my dorm. But before I can get started there, I'm going to have to take a couple parts out of my current build. This is the build I've been using for the last couple years. It's got a 6700K and a GTX 1070 in it. I'll be taking the memory, storage, graphics card, and cooler out of this system. Now that I've scavenged some parts from my old build, now I should have everything I need to get my new one going, except for a 3080 because I'm still looking for one. I'm starting the build by just getting my motherboard ready, and I noticed while putting my M.2 SSD in, I took this little heatsink off. But this standoff, it was right here. But when you try to screw this down in here with that standoff still in place, it actually makes it flex a little bit. So I'm going to take that out just to make sure it doesn't cause any problems. And I recommend you do as well if you get the same board. So I've just finished installing my 5800X, and I noticed something a bit depressing. So the chip comes in this, but that is the box. So 80% of this thing is just this folded piece of paper to press it up against the little window over here. So why not just give us a small box containing this? I mean, this piece of paper, you could probably fold it into a box that would fit that. I just thought that was kind of dumb. Now everything on the motherboard is put in, so I'm going to work on getting it into this case. One thing to note though, with these cooler hardware, when you get a new cooler, make sure you hold on to the other hardware. Because when I bought this AIO, I never imagined that I'd be going with AMD for my next build, because they were such an underdog for a while. But the last generation's Intel has been having a very rough time, and I am glad that I still had the AMD hardware. So, something to keep in mind. Something really nice about this case is that just about everything on it can be taken off just with your hands. It's almost entirely toolless. And all of the panels have these magnetic dust filters on them. They're not very fine, but it'll still be better than nothing. So at first you're greeted with the Radiator Mount right here. So I'll be mounting my Kraken on there. And as you can probably notice, I've already put in the power supply and routed some of my cables, because the case and everything else came way before my motherboard, so I got excited and just started routing things like how I saw people do it on YouTube. So there's already my Noctua A9 with its grill, and then I have my Corsair SF750 in there. At this point, I've managed to get the motherboard into the chassis. I decided to take off anything that I could without unscrewing, just so I'd have a little more space to reach around in here. And I found that I saw it online, and I think it is the best way to do it, is routing the CPU power and any cables for your AIO underneath the motherboard, because then they'll just come out down here and you won't see them really. Because any other way is going to end up with much more cable bulk, like if you run them up this way and then up here, because it comes with these little straps to keep it out of the way, but it's still nice to just have it behind. I've got just about everything plugged in on my motherboard. One tip is just make sure to plug your motherboard power in after the SATA cables, because once you're trying to reach underneath this, it can be really hard because you're also trying to route downwards. But now it's time for me to put my storage in, which I already have the M.2 on the motherboard, but now I'm just putting in my SATA SSDs. One thing that I thought was pretty cool is that on this case, you just put these little grommets in, and then you screw the accompanying pegs into your SSD, and then you just pop it right on like that. And you can see through there, they all stick right through, and it actually feels like it's on there pretty solid, but I just thought that was interesting. Now my SSDs are fully installed, they've been plugged in, and I also got my graphics card fit in there. Just barely though. It was really difficult to get these cables pushed back far enough. It still looks like this might be being pushed down a little, but I think it'll be just fine. It's probably good that I started this with my 1070 though, because it's going to be much harder to get a 3080 in there. But now it's on to just the cooling. I've got all the cables ran for it already, and this will just plug into this fan, so it'll go with this curve. But I've got to install the fans on the top and the AIO, and that's about it. I've just finished attaching the radiator to the mounting bracket, and I've got to say, this thing just barely fits in here. I knew the 280 millimeters was the biggest radiator you could fit here, but the Kraken fit pretty much perfectly. Like, it wasn't, to get it flush here, you have to actually like clip it in, because you can see it's right up against the edge, and like this bracket is actually kind of hugging the radiator. So definitely don't try to go anything bigger. As I showed with the 92 millimeter, I really recommend putting these grills on every fan you can inside such a small machine like this, because it's going to be really nice to not have to worry about any cables getting caught up in them. And also, when you're mounting to a radiator with one of these grills on it, don't use any washers, because then the screw won't be long enough. Because my AIO recommends using these washers, but those are just thick enough that the screws won't reach. So now my AIO is installed. I turned it on, seems like everything's working as it should, so now I'm just going to put the two top fans on and then get it all back together. For now on the top, I'm just using this Silencio and the sickle flow that came with the case, while my NFF12s come in the mail. But I just wanted to point out this cool mounting method up here. So it has the grommets, like the SSDs, and it comes with one of these grills, but they have these posts that will screw onto the grill itself, and then it just goes right through the fan, and then you can just push the fan on like the SSDs. So now it's on. So as long as these are screwed on there, it's pretty much toolless mounting. Fans are in, and I just popped the top panel back on, and it looks like everything's working well. So now it's just time to mount this AIO on the side. So I've ran into a clearance issue. So on the radiator, I've got two NFA14s, and in the back I have an NFA9, and they actually hit right here. So I'm going to remove the A9, and then I'll put the radiator in. I took out the 92 millimeter fan, and now the radiator fits just fine. It took a little bit of wiggling, and the main thing is just to make sure your GPU power cables aren't stopping it from sliding all the way in. But besides that, it was pretty smooth. I just made sure the tubes on the actual block are on this side, which just made it so it'll fold in nicely. But yeah, really not as bad as I thought it would be. I thought it would be much harder to get this radiator in here. So I guess now it's just time to see if this thing's actually posting and get Windows on it. So now it's just time for the moment of truth. It's just connected to the middle monitor, but I guess we will see. So I finally got it to post. I had to flash the BIOS to the latest version. This forum post helped a lot. When I first opened it after it didn't work the first time, I was greeted by the most comforting thing in the world during a GPU shortage, the VGA light. So I kind of just went through and reseated everything but the CPU, and that wasn't working, but flashing the BIOS seems to have worked, so now it's time to get Windows on. Now I've got Windows installing. I had moved it over there and plugged everything in, but then I wasn't getting anything on the screen. But when I moved it back and connected it to this screen again, it's all working just fine. So I'm just going to let Windows install and then see if that fixes the problem. Because it was booting to a separate drive that had the grub loader on it, so it might just be something weird with that. So we'll see. At this point, I've got Windows activated, but I still can't get it to reliably, like, even post if I start it connected to this monitor. I had to start it connected to this one and then just move the DisplayPort cable over. So now I'm just getting all the drivers and everything. I'm just hoping it's a display driver that's messing it up. But so it's looking like the problem is just that I had no display adapter, because in Device Manager it only shows the Microsoft Basic one, and when I first started up GeForce it said no driver found, so I'm thinking that's why it won't show up on this monitor. Installing the display drivers and just all the other general drivers seems to have fixed the problem. Now I think it's working just fine. And I've got the lighting how I want it. And it had, when it was using that basic Microsoft display adapter, it wouldn't show me any of the GPU stats, so that kind of tipped me off, but now it's all working just fine. So I think that's about it. That's how it looks with the side panel on. I think this case is going to fit way better into my dorm. If you're interested in doing a build similar to mine, before I did mine, I drew up some basic schematics with some of the rationale for why I chose the parts that I did, and this will be available in the description along with that forum post that helped me flash the BIOS. So if you just want more information, check that out, and if you have questions, just send them to my Twitter. So little update, I'm taking the computer back apart because I was able to get a 3080 Ti from the Best Buy drop today. Waited in line for 17 hours, but I was able to get one. I was in first in line, so I'm going to put this bad boy in now. So I got it in the chassis. It actually fit way better than I thought it would. I think it's a bit smaller than my Strix 1070, so it just went right in. I actually took the bottom off and everything because I thought it would be harder to fit, but it went right in. I did notice that earlier I ran 2 GPU power cables because I thought I'd get a different version of the card that would need 3 8-pins. But with this splitter, one of this connector wouldn't fit into the splitter on either side. So I actually had to use both of the cables I ran. So I'm glad I did that earlier. But it actually looks pretty good in there. I really like the Founders Editions this gen, and I'm actually pretty happy I ended up with one. Well, the 3080 Ti is in, and everything's working as expected. Just updating my drivers, but yeah. So, of course, it wasn't actually running as expected. It was still doing the thing where it'll only show the BIOS and everything on HDMI, but now it wouldn't even show Windows, where before I could just wait until Windows is booted up and then it'll show, and then it wasn't. So I actually had to go into the BIOS and turn on CSM, and it seems to have fixed all the problems that I had been having, and now it's actually working perfectly. I've played a couple games on it so far, and I can just crank everything to max and still get like 200 FPS. So I think this thing will do well for quite a long time. So I think this build is about done. I realized that this card is nowhere near as thick as the Strix card that I planned to get, so there actually will be room for 120mm fans down here. So I have ordered some Noctua NFF12s, the Chromax ones, and I'll be putting those under there with a fan controller. But besides that, this build is complete. Thanks for watching me build it.